So again, good morning, everybody. And I've decided to, for the next week or two or three, depending how far I get today, to deal with the subject of superstition in Judaism. And it's one that I taught a course many years ago, could be like 30 years ago. And I was looking back over my notes, and what struck me was a particular superstition that was prevalent in 19th century Europe, which said that during epidemics, one opens the door only when the person outside has knocked 3 times. And that was one that emanated from Galicia, which may be places where some of you hail from or your predecessors. So I felt that made it relevant to the current time. But I think it's a subject that is so much a part of Jewish life that, and life in general, and a lot of the things we do today in ritual originate in superstition, some which is well known and some which is totally not known. So I want to, I think you'll find it a topic of interest. Firstly, I just want to point out to you a major source for what I'm going to talk about today and thereafter, perhaps, which is a book that was written in 1939 called Jewish Magic and Superstition, and it is by Joshua Trachtenberg. Again, this is written in 1939. The latest reprint, I think, is 2004. It is still available. It is available as a Kindle book for $2.99. So if you're interested in the subject, this is really the primary source. And it's written in a 1939 academic style, so it's not light reading, but it is packed with fascinating information, and some of which I will be sharing with you and from other sources as well, including Talmudic sources in the time that follows. So I thought I would begin with a couple of scattered Jewish superstitions and then back up and do this more thematically. One is that there was a superstition that originated in Eretz Yisrael, in Palestine, in the probably in the late Middle Ages, and which was a remedy for infertility. And what it was, the thought at the time was that if one who was unable to have children wanted to do so, what you had to do, you had to drink the water that had been cooked with moss growing on the Jerusalem walls. So you had to collect moss from the walls of Jerusalem, boil the moss, and drink that water. So might have really given one something to think about. Do I really want to have children if this is what I have to do in order to be able to do so? And another superstition that originates in Minsk, Minsk was very rich in superstition, evidently. I don't know if any of you are Minskers. This is one that good to keep in mind. If you're ever choking on a fishbone, hopefully that will not happen. What you do is you put another fishbone on your head, and you will either swallow the fishbone that you're choking on, or it will come out. And if the bone happens to be a meat bone, you put a meat bone on your head, and the result will be the same. So I was trying to find medical evidence of the efficacy of that treatment, but it was evidently very popular in Minsk. Now, if there was a superstition, I don't have a place of origin, but if you recited a bracha, a blessing over a piece of bread, you would be in danger unless you cut it in half before eating it. And that is clearly, there are parallels in general, like non-Jewish superstitions as well. And here's something like really interesting. And we're going to look at life cycle events starting with birth in a few moments, and then go through marriage and then death in terms of the superstitions that come in those various life cycle of times of life. But in terms of just a couple of scattered ideas from marriage, there are 2 very similar superstitions that emanate from marriage. and I guess there were two traditions. One is that, and this is also a Minsker tradition, that after you get married, on returning from the chuppah, the bride takes the groom's hand first. She will be dominant in family matters. If the groom takes the bride's hand first, then he will be in charge of household affairs. Very similar to that, and I see you're taking notes here, so that's good to know. Similar to that is, a similar tradition is, if the bridegroom stepped on the bride's foot when both are under the chuppah, it is a sign that he's going to be dominant. But if she steps on his foot, she's going to control him. So I have this vision, and when we get able to return to doing weddings, that I'm going to see bride and groom seeing each one trying to step on each other's foot first. That will be very interesting to see if it would happen. I'm seeing some smiles, so I think you can relate to this. Okay, a couple of other scattered. And by the way, if you come from Pinsk or from Bialystok, make sure that you never steal an egg, because if you steal an egg, we're told, you're going to have 7 years of poverty. So do not steal eggs. I'm not sure if that counts, if that includes the scrambled eggs that are served at enhanced breakfasts, if you remember those things that used to occur at shul. So, but that's a little harder to steal scrambled eggs. You have to really be desperate. And it's hard to measure what is exactly one egg, but anything is possible. Okay, let's see if I have 1 or 2 more samples, general samples of, I'll give you 1 more. Now, this is kind of weird. These are the things, they're all weird. And this is a Kiev tradition that you don't want to ever step over a child. In other words, you're walking and there's a child lying on the floor. Don't step over a child. I see some of you nodding. You may be familiar with this. Because the superstition was that, anyone know? I'll unmute you if you raise a hand. Okay, I see John raising it. Yeah, I think John is right. But let me unmute John, and he's going to tell us when we find John first. Okay, let's go on your picture. Unmute.
Yeah,
What does it mean if you? What happens if you step over a child? I'm trying to unmute you and I can't.
Okay, here we go. Yeah, what I heard was the child will not grow to their full height.
Right, that's it. That's the superstition. Good work. So the child will not grow over, will stop growing at that point. But if let's say you accidentally step over the child, if you reverse it, then the problem is solved. So you have to step back over, return. So step, like in a sense, you're unstepping over, you're reversing by walking over the child again. But overall, it's a good thing not to do. Okay, let's see if, 1 more, and then we'll go on to a more sequential view of this. It has to do with ovens. And if you go to the baking supply section of any supermarket today, you're going to find it very hard to get things that you use for baking. Not that I do a lot of baking, but those have been cleared. We resolved the toilet paper issue. So now it's the baking product issue. You need flour or this or that, or these are baking soda, baking powder. These are harder to find today. So this is important to keep in mind. This is from Minsk again, that you never leave a stove or oven empty. If you have nothing to cook or bake in it, put a piece of wood in the oven. If you leave it empty, you may never have anything again to bake in the future when you want to bake. So don't leave your oven empty. Put something in a piece of wood, a place. Okay, those are scattered, assorted superstitions. I want to share with you something which, before I get to the Jewish stuff, many years ago on some kind of vacation, I picked up this booklet in the U.S. in one of these country stores. The country store is the place where a couple goes in, and the wife is fascinated by all of these tchotchkes, and the husband is just bored out of his mind. So I went to the, or vice versa sometimes, I guess, but maybe both are interested. But I was looking at, they had these little pamphlets, and so this was one called Pioneer Superstitions, like superstitions going back to the pioneer era in the US. So just to share a couple of those with you. And very interesting because there are a lot of Jewish parallels. So there is a pioneer superstition. I'm guessing it's like 18th or 19th century, it could be 17th, 18th, 19th century US. So marriages taking place at the full of the moon are best for happiness and prosperity. June weddings on the full moon were considered the luckiest, and people married in January were usually good and true. When we get to talking about weddings in Jewish tradition, from the superstition point of view, you'll see a lot of parallel sayings to that. And there also, and you have parallels in Jewish tradition to this as well. I'm just going to brief, there were all kinds of interpretations if you had various physical phenomena taking place. If your left hand itched, you expect to receive a gift. If the right hand itched, you're going to shake hands with a stranger. No more, sorry. If the right ear burns, someone is saying nice things about you, and you hear that phrase, your ear must be burning. So that goes back, that's a pretty old superstition. If the left ear burns, somebody is criticizing you. So if you have a burning ear, make sure you determine whether it's left or right, because it's very different. If the right eye itches, expect to be lucky. If it's the left eye, it means a disappointment. And if the joint of the thumb itches, expect an unwelcome visitor, which in today's time means anybody, unfortunately, is unwelcome because of the nature of the. Okay, I think that's enough of this. So this is just a fun book that I got many years ago. Okay. And I will do as I did last time. In about in a few moments, I will pause and open up to questions. You can also, I'll put on the chat, and if anybody wants to write a question that I can acknowledge as I'm talking, just hard when we have, we're now into 35 people, which is, I'm delighted by the number that is here. It's very hard for 35 people to be talking out and it just becomes inaudible, but I will be happy to try to recognize questions. So I want to start off with birth, and this will take a considerable amount of time because of the nature of superstition surrounding birth. And we're also going to look at a Talmudic text on the theme of birth and how it intersects with superstition. So when in Jewish tradition, and most of this is medieval, when a woman was in childbirth, she was being protected. And a lot of protection, when you were trying to protect someone, what were you protecting her from? Primarily from shadim, from evil spirits. And we'll talk more about shadim as we go along, and the importance of shadim in terms of a lot of the things we do today, and we don't know why we're doing them. But one of the customs that goes back, a few centuries, was that when a woman was about to deliver, a Sefer Torah or tefillin were placed on her bed. In other words, they were in that sense seen as amulets, seen as protective of the mother. I've told stories often in the past of a chassid who used to come to JTS when I was a student, and he was a bookseller, a mocher svarim. And I developed a really nice relationship with him. I loved the man. His name was Rabbi Scheim, Shimon Gruber. And he's a character. And I was his best customer. And I have all these svarim that he would sell me that I had no use for, but I just couldn't resist him. And it was an opportunity for me to practice my Yiddish. So now I was one of the very few students who knew any Yiddish, so we would converse in Yiddish all the time. And this is a real character. I could go on for the whole hour just talking about him. But he sold me a book once, which was the Torah commentary of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. It's a huge book. It is incomprehensible, and that's putting it nicely. My Hebrew's good. I mean, but it's just incomprehensible. I got through like 4 lines of it, and it's like 1,000 pages. But he said that, he said, the Dav's koifen dem sefer. You have to buy this book. So favos. And he showed me at the beginning that it said in the introduction, like the opening page, it said, "This book being present in your house will protect you." Like it's such a holy book that just having it in your house will protect you. So of course you have to buy it. How could I say no? I'm not going to buy it. But so the idea that clearly around childbirth, it was considered that the mother needed protection, again, protection primarily from evil spirits that could, God forbid, harm the fetus. And so he did various things, and one of them was putting the Sefer Torah in the bed, or the tefillin on the bed. I guess not everybody could have the Sefer Torah, but every home would have tefillin, so that was easier to do. This question about the red bindle, that's a similar, I think that's, I believe that Bernie's asking about where the red bindle, the red thread, there was a custom of going, when a woman was in childbirth, or anybody was ill, you'd go to the grave of a tzaddik, of a righteous person. You would take a piece of cloth or a string, and you'd wrap it around the grave 7 times, and then you would take that string and wrap it around the individual who needed the help. Again, it was a protection device, but the connection to the tzaddik, who you were remembering, to the righteous person, was going to enable the person, whether the mother to give birth healthily or the other person to survive illness. So I believe the red bindle is a version of that, but it doesn't require to, because this would be a very long piece of string. But the red bindle is not that long, but I'm suspecting it comes from the same place. Okay, so so Barbara came from Kiev, so that's how from the ancestry, so you can relate to it. Red bindle. See if there are any other questions here that I can answer now before I go on. Okay, so let's go to back into childbirth a little bit, and you can keep posting. I'm keeping an eye on the chat if you have other questions that come up. And there's lighting of candles, which is considered to be also protection. Light is something that would scare off demons, so that was something that would be done as well. There was in Salonika, there was a custom to leave the doors of the house and all the cupboards open during pregnancy. That would prevent, God forbid, a miscarriage. And also the idea, again, is what I just shared with you, of taking the string 7 times around the grave of a renowned rabbi, and then binding it around the stomach of the pregnant woman to ensure a safe pregnancy. There's a lot of, you see in a lot of different places in demonology and Judaism, the idea of the circle, sometimes referred to as the magic circle, which is basically a shield of protection around the person you're trying to protect. In this case, a mother who's going to give birth, but it could also be somebody who's ill or somebody in any other kind of danger. And remember, of course, that in pre-modern times, or one could say 300 years ago in Judaism is modernity already, but in most of the world it's not modernity. In going back a few centuries, childbirth was a very dangerous phenomenon. And thank God. I mean, it's always always concerned. You want to hear good news. And you always say in tradition, B'shat Tova. You don't say Mazel Tov traditionally before the baby is born. That's only after the baby is born. But before that, you say B'shat Tova, in a good hour. In other words, may everything be good, which also reflects some of the superstition going back of the fear, because everything should come out well. Thank God today we reverse most of the difficulties of earlier times. But at one point, when a lot of these superstitions originated, it was really a very precarious moment for everybody. So what I want to do now is look at a Talmudic text with you, because we talked about ways of protecting the mother, but there also is a lot of ancient Jewish, I guess we could say, superstition in terms of when you were born, the day you were born. This also sort of coincides with astrology, that is something that in Talmudic times was widespread. In other words, it was something that there were a lot of serious Jews, including rabbis, who took astrology very seriously, but also felt that the day you were born, or even the hour you were born, could determine your destiny in life. So I'm going to post something on the screen. Oh, Brenda's asking about the bride walking around the groom. We're going to get to that. Absolutely, and it very much relates to this. Okay, 1 second. Let's share a screen. Okay. You're now seeing a text very close to the end of Tractate Shabbat. I'm using the Steinsaltz Koren edition, which is a magnificent new edition of the Talmud, and which incorporates Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary in the translation of the original Aramaic or Hebrew text. And this is something which basically has very little to do with what came before, because we're talking about there's various laws in terms of Shabbat prior to this that deal with all kinds of various issues as to are you allowed to stuff a chicken? You're allowed to overfeed a chicken on Shabbat, other things, so that other kinds of unusual issues which don't always confront us. But finally we get to this concluding portion of Shabbat, which basically are just various assorted issues that don't have a lot to do with Shabbat and don't have a lot to do with what came before. So the text I'm posting right now on the screen, we basically start off with, it says here that it was a Ketiv a Pinkasei that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. It was written in the notebook of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who's a very, very significant Talmudic sage. Haiman de V'chad B'Shabbata, one who is born on the first day of the week, i.e. Sunday, Yigavar V'lo Chadabe, and he will be a person, there will be no one like him. There will be and there will not be one in him. He'll be a person and there will not be one in him. And as you can see, this is a really strange phrase. And so the Talmud doesn't really understand it and says, what are you talking about? What does it mean there will not be one in him? If you say there is not one quality for the best, that can't be, because Rabbi Ashi says, I was born the first day of the week, and one cannot say there was nothing good about him. So the other saying, maybe it means the guy has nothing. The guy's a gornish. The guy has nothing of quality in him. There's nothing there. And so Rabbi Ashi says, well, I was born Sunday, and you can't say there's nothing good to say about me. I guess he had a little bit of he wasn't the most modest person around. So then he says, rather, it must mean that there is not one quality for the worse. There are no bad qualities. There will not be one in him. What's not going to be in him? So maybe it means a bad quality. And and then didn't Rav Ashi say, I and Dimi Bar Katsutka were both born on the first day of the week. I became king, the head of yeshiva. He became the head of a gang of thieves. So we're both born the same day of the week. And Dimi becomes a thief, and I become a sage. So it's irrelevant. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad. So what's the reason for saying the first day of the week doesn't determine your quality? Because both light and darkness were created on the first day of creation. Okay, so this is dealing with Sunday. I think there are some questions. I just want to see 1 second if I can find your questions. It's hard for me when I'm sharing the screen. So I may just defer your questions for a couple of moments. And once I've finished the screen sharing, then I will be able to see your questions. So if you're born on the second day of the week, you're born on Monday, you're going to be short-tempered. You're going to be a ragzan. You're always barogiz. You're always angry. So why? Why are you going to be an angry person if you're born on Monday? Because on that day, the second day of creation, the upper and the lower waters were divided. And what that means, other commentaries suggest what that means is a day of contentiousness. That division, separation is painful, and people are upset when that happens. And when you have, look at divorce, it's not this contention, it's painful. Any kind of separation of two things that would normally be together, when there's a separation, it is what our tradition calls the Havdalah Shel Tsa'ar, a painful separation. And that's one of the explanations as to why when we make Havdalah after Shabbat, we have spices, because to revive us because of getting over the pain of the separation of the regular Shabbat from the regular week that's to follow. So you're born on Tuesday. Okay, what happens? I mean, Tuesday is my favorite day because it's a short Shir Shel Yom. The Psalm of the day is very short on Tuesday. So Tuesday and Friday have really short. Wednesday, you're going to be there a long time. It's a very long song of the day. So Wednesday is a really tough day. Okay, but that's not what it says here. If you're born on the third day of the week on Tuesday, you will be rich and promiscuous. Why? What favus? Because on that day, the third day, vegetation was created, It grows abundantly, but it is also mixed together without boundaries between the grass and the plants. So promiscuous means there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of stuff. By the way, there's a lot of, when we get to marriage, we're going to talk about the third day, Yom Shlishi, being a day auspicious for weddings, because Kitov, it will be good, is repeated twice on the third day of the week of creation in the first chapter of Genesis. Born on the fourth day of the week, you will be wise and enlightened. What's the reason for this? Because the heavenly lights were hung in the heavens on that day. Wisdom is likened to light. Okay, these also, there's, interesting, there's always a textual reason. It's not a superstition that comes out of the thin air. It is always a it is always a basis, a textual basis for it. Okay, born on the fifth day of the week, b'chamisha d'shavta, you're going to be a gavar gomel chasadim. You're going to be a person who performs acts of kindness. What's the reason for this? It's because on that day, the fish and the fowl were created, and they do not receive their sustenance by performing work for people. They are sustained by the kindness of God alone. In other words, other animals that actually do things for human beings, they do labor, they do other things. So that's their so that's why they would get sustenance. They're fed in order to do work, but fish and fowl don't do a lot of work. The herring don't build buildings or anything. They don't do a lot of work. So it's God's kindness, to the idea of kindness, chesed, connecting to the fifth day. And I'm saying all of these theories are not really subject to scientific investigation, but it's kind of interesting nonetheless. Born on the sixth day, on Friday, you're going to be a seeker. You're going to be a seeker. What does that mean? Because they says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said that it means that he will be one who seeks out mitzvot. Why? Because you're always busy on Friday getting ready for Shabbos. So and if you're born on Shabbat, one who was born on Shabbat, B'Shabta Yamut, will also die in Shabbat. Why? Because they desecrated the great day of Shabbat on his behalf, because the act of birth does involve desecration of Shabbat. The same way Brit Milah takes place on Shabbat, which involves surgery that normally would not be permitted on Shabbat, but is permitted any day if it's the 8th day after birth, including on Yom Kippur. Rav Bar Rav Shilas says he will be called a person of great sanctity because he was born on the sacred day of Shabbat. And we've often heard, I'm just going to go off screen for now. We've often heard the idea that people ask me, if someone dies on Shabbat or Yom Tov, does that mean that he or she was a special person? Now here you have it in Tractate Shabbat, where that's a point of view that is expressed. So I want to look at questions right now, because there've been a few. Marla, correct. I mean, that basically, I mentioned that Kitov appears twice on the Tuesday, and that's why it's good, and that's why it becomes auspicious for there being a wedding. But did not the fishing tribe of Israel sustain the learning one? I'm not sure I understand that. It's coming from iPad, so you have to basically change your name because other people have taken that name already. And so that gives you some sense. Those are the questions. I want to go back briefly to the Talmud. Any other questions before I proceed? Okay. I'll unmute Joyce. I'm going to unmute you to ask the question. What's the question, Joyce?
I was under the impression that most of the superstitions came from Eastern Europe. I didn't know that they found it in Israel.
Well, a lot come from, good question. A lot come from Eastern Europe. Some come from Western Europe. Some come from the Sephardic world. And some come from America, as you will see as we go further, and some are ancient. We have superstitions coming from everywhere, but there are a lot coming from Eastern Europe. That's true, and we've seen like Minsk and Pinsk and other European, a lot originate from there, and we will see more of that as we move along. I'm just looking for hands if I see them. Okay, Barbara, 1 second. Okay, well, I'm unmuting Barbara. Go ahead.
I was wondering about the horoscope. Was there any connection in an interpretation, because they give you personalities of days when your birthday appears?
There's a lot of stuff, and if you, I just don't go into that. It's its own separate topic, but there is a whole lot of interest in astrology, and there also is debate amongst the sages as to whether this is valid. Because you're gonna see some text I'm gonna do in a minute that will get more specific about that. And then there's argument of this is nonsense. Some say it's Narishkeit, it's nonsense, and some say that they really believed it. And you have some ancient temples in Israel, if you do the tour of some of the ancient synagogues, where there are astrological signs on in the mosaics. So astrology was very much part of Jewish. Not everybody was happy about that. It was something that was controversial, but there were a lot who accepted astrology. And you see this discussion that people took that kind of seriously, that they really felt these were signs that should be taken seriously in terms of how you view the world. I'm just looking. This is an advantage when you have your picture showing that I can actually see if there are hands up. I'm just doing a quick. Anna, 1 second. I'm going to unmute Anna.
I'm looking at the chat on the computer, and there's one from John and one from Brenda. And the question from John is, what is it about the hand symbol and the Kanena Hora? And from Brenda, it was, what about the practice of the bride walking around the groom 7 times? Well,
I did address the walking around, but I'm really holding that off till I talk about marriage. But I'm saying it does relate. It definitely relates to superstition. But I'm gonna hold that up. We're gonna get to that. I'm just not doing that now. The Hamsa, I don't have a lot to say on that because I don't really know a lot about that.
But the hand symbol and the Kanena Hora?
Okay, Kanena Hora, I can tell you. Kanena Hora, it's Kain Ayin Hara, or in Hebrew, Bli Ayin Hara, which means it's basically we're trying to avert the evil eye. So what that means is that's a reason, by the way, it explains a lot in terms of Jewish tradition, because why do we not give, if we go back to a classical synagogue where only men had aliyot, the custom always was that you never gave a father and son consecutive aliyot. And now we move into a more egalitarian world, you say you don't give parent and child, or too many aliyot to one family. Why? Because you're worried about the ayin hara, the evil eye, that if one family gets too much good, other people wish bad upon them. So, and that's why we see you don't want to, so because people will be envious, they'll be jealous, so you don't want to put somebody in a situation that will arouse others being jealous and they will wish bad things on them. I mean, it's a very negative view of humanity, but so when you say Bli Ayin Hara, Kanena Hora, it's really Kain Ayin Hara. It's just slurred together. So because Kanena Hora, there'd be no evil eye. In other words, you say that normally when you say somebody, so-and-so just won the lottery, Kanena Hora. You don't want to wish bad on them, or someone. You're not going to say someone just passed away. It's a terrible happened. It wouldn't make sense. It's something really good happens. You say that you want to, or you want to say something. You want to share good news, or someone shares good news. You say, no one should cast the evil eye on you. The eye of envy, the eye of jealousy that could cause harm. So that's a really very, very good question about the ayin hara. I'm not about the hand signal, the Hamsa. I don't know a lot about that, to be honest. I'll try to research that and get back to you on it. So I'm very quickly going to. Okay, I see Mel. Okay, I'm gonna unmute you, Mel.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know. I'm very involved in genealogy.
Right.
My grandfather was born June 10th, 1876, which was a Saturday. And he died on a Saturday on the steps of Sher Shemayim, going to shul.
Wow.
So it's just amazing when you're brought up on the Saturday. He was quite Orthodox.
Well,
it's just amazing. I just looked it up. I remember him dying on Saturday.
So is your grandfather? It was your father's father?
No, my mother's.
Okay, so he wasn't a Kohen, was he?
No. No,
Okay, so that's it. But
two other questions I had to ask. This particular grandfather has not something interesting that when a person in the old country became very ill, they changed the name. So the Malachamovitz wouldn't
Right.
know where, couldn't find the, so he really on his Mitzvah, there's two names. One was the name he was born with, and the one was the name that was given to him.
Yep.
Uh,
That's absolutely terrific. You're absolutely right, 100%. I would mention that when we get to death, which will be probably next week. But you're absolutely right. That was to confuse the Malachamavis. You go into the wrong address, and that comes up in a few aspects of issues dealing with death. That where superstition plays a very much very significant part of ritual that we practice today. So thank you, Mel. That was great. Okay, see, Stephen, I'm going to unmute you. Hey, Stephen, let me unmute you. I'm good. Don't you touch any buttons. Let me try to do it. Okay, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, and also isn't that the custom with Lilit, with the reason why Orthodox boys don't get their haircut till they're 3 because of the confusion between men and women, young kids, and they don't want the evil malach, is a malach hamavet or somebody to get the boys, so they don't differentiate in terms of their hair, so that they get confused as well.
Good. I mean, the problem is now we all have hair. Like we don't let our hair get cut. So
Not me.
Yeah. So some of us look like I'm now doing my Bernie Sanders imitation in terms of hairstyle, not anything else. So no, thank you, Stephen. That's true, and it's very good. So I'm seeing there are quite a few comments, so I'm going to try to get to all of you. If you don't have your picture showing, I can't see your hands, unfortunately. There is a way of waving a hand on Zoom, but that's pretty complicated. I'm not even sure how to explain. Linda, I'm going to unmute you. Linda, go ahead, and Lynn, I'll be with you next.
Yeah,
Linda?
I think it's related to Kanena Hara, but I remember as a child, my grandmother who came from Poland, before she left, besides giving us many blessings on our heads, she would go poo, 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 poo. And like my grandfather used to say, line up for your shower, we're leaving now.
Yeah, that was to just basically blow away the evil spirits.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of weird things we do that still are practiced in many cases. I'm looking. Okay, Lynn wanted. Lynn, I'm unmuting you. Okay, Lynn.
When my kids were born, I was told that they were not supposed to see themselves in a mirror until they were a year old. And I was wondering where that came from.
Well, I haven't heard that specific one, but when we talk about death, we'll talk about mirrors. But mirrors basically are considered places where shadim lurk, like evil spirits congregate on mirrors. That's really the reason for covering the mirrors. In more modern times, we explain it by saying we're not supposed to be concerned about vanity, about your appearance when you're in mourning. That's not the reason. The reason is that you're trying to wipe away, you're trying to remove a hiding place for shadim. Where shadim would lurk at mirrors, there's certain places they would congregate, and that would probably explain why, in what you're suggesting here in terms of for a young child. I hadn't heard that specific version, but it clearly would connect to the other. So that would be the obvious reason, because you don't want to endanger the young child. Why, by the way, again, I'm sort of looking into death right now, but it's okay. This all interrelates. One of the in the questions. One of the most asked rabbinic questions that I receive, not as much today, unfortunately, because people can't really attend. It's very restricted who can go to a cemetery. But I would often be asked the question, can a pregnant woman go into the cemetery? Can a pregnant woman go in? That's a very common question that rabbis are asked. And my answer is, tell me what your feelings are about shade and about evil spirits. And if they say, well, I don't really believe in this, then it's fine. It's okay. The reason for a pregnant woman not going onto a cemetery is the belief that evil spirits, shadim, congregate at cemeteries, and you'd be endangering the fetus. You're putting the fetus in danger because of the presence of evil spirits at the cemetery. So if one is not concerned about shadim, there'd be no reason not to go. But I do say with 2 exceptions, 2 provisos. One is that if you have a family member that you have to honor, such as a parent or a grandparent, who feels strongly about that practice, then out of respect to them, you have reason not to go. I mean, not because you're worried about the evil spirit, but because you don't want to upset your grandmother or your great-grandmother, your whoever, you don't want to respect a relative you have to honor. You don't want to upset them by being present there. So that's a reason not to go. The other reason is that, going to the cemetery can be stressful. And if you're expecting, you want to avoid unnecessary stress. So that may be a clinical reason to suggest not to go, but there is no halachic reason not to go. There's not part of Jewish law. It's, if you look in any of the compendiums on Jewish practices in death and dying and mourning, there is no prohibition of a pregnant woman going to the cemetery based on superstition, but it may have valid reasons to be fulfilled for other reasons beyond the superstition. But that's very similar, that the idea of places where places of extreme happiness and extreme sadness were major hangouts for evil spirits. I'm just looking for hands, and I want to see if there are any. I don't see any more. So I'm going to go on in text. Okay. So, by the way, these are all great questions. So I really appreciate them, and I'll come back. I'll come back to. I'll come back to questions after. 1 second. Okay, let me go back to screen share. And this will sound a lot like astrology, and it does correlate to astrology. So we have here a whole, continuing in the text in Shabbat, a whole discussion of, not only what day you were born, but under what planet were you born. This is really, so we read that if you were born under the influence of the sun, you're going to be radiant. You will eat from your own resources, drink from your own resources. Your secrets will be exposed. If he steals, he will not succeed, because he will be like the sun that shines and is revealed to all. If you're born under the influence of Venus, see, the sages really, they knew the planets, and it's quite incredible. If you're born under the sage of Venus, then you're going to be rich and promiscuous. Those seem to go together. Because fire was born during the hour of Venus, you'll be subject to the fire of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which burns perpetually. Now, if you're born under the influence of Mercury, and you're going to be enlightened and an expert, because Mercury is the sun's sofer, the sun's scribe, as it's closest to the sun. Okay, you're closest to the sun, so you're going to be really enlightened, light, to get the connection. If you're born under the influence of the moon, you're going to be one who suffers pains, who builds and destroys and builds. You're going to be one who doesn't eat from his own resources, drinks not from his own resources, whose secrets are hidden. If he steals, he will succeed, as he's like the moon that constantly changes form, whose light is not his own, and who at times is exposed and sometimes hidden. So make sure, by the way, be wary of anybody who's born under the moon. You have to be very, very, very careful and very wary. If you're born under the influence of Saturn, you'll be one whose thoughts are for naught or for garnish. And some say that everything that others think about him is for naught. So the two ways of looking at it: either your thoughts are going to be meaningless, or what people think about you will be meaningless. I'm not sure of the reason for that, but I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over it. Now, the next one I like: if you're born under the influence of Jupiter, the Hebrew name for Jupiter is tzedek. You know what tzaddik is? It means you're going to be a tzadkan, you're going to be a righteous person. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, and just in this context means just in the performance of mitzvot. In other words, you're going to be a tzaddik when it comes to the performance of mitzvot, but it's a good sign to be born under Jupiter. That's a good symbol. And the most interesting one, this will be the last one that I look at with you, is that if you're born under the influence of Mars, which in Hebrew is ma'adim, from the word adom, bleeding blood, that if you're going to be born under the influence of ma'adim, you're going to be one who spills blood. Again, because the etymology of the Hebrew for Mars, and Mars is known as the red planet. So it's not simply in Jewish tradition that it has that connection to blood. You're going to be one who is a shofech damim, you're going to be one who spills blood. So Rav Ashi said he will either be a bloodletter, one who lets blood, like a surgeon, or a shoichet, a slaughterer, a ritual slaughterer, or a moil, a circumciser, because that's a way of, you can be a shedder of blood, but in a context of mitzvah. It doesn't mean a shedder of blood means you have to be a murderer, because one could say, I am born under Mars, I'm going to hide from the world because I can kill people. No, you can also be a doctor. You can be a surgeon, you can be a moil, you can be a shoichet. Try not to do all three at the same time, because that could be a little hard. But and so the sage Rabbah says that I was born under the influence of Mars, of a Ma'adim, and I don't do any of those things. But he said, so Abai tries to say, I'll explain how that could be possible. He says, but you're a judge. You're a judge in the rabbinic court, but you also punish, and you can actually kill somebody by or decreeing a capital punishment. And not that he ever did, but that's the way. I'm not sure that's great comfort. I'm not sure that's, oh, great, I can sentence someone to death so I can be a murderer, so that's good. But it just shows that, interesting connection between how we relate things like not only what day you were born, but also under what planet were you born, what was hovering over you when you were born. I'm not sure how that's determined, by the way, but that's beyond my level of expertise in these matters. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share. And I will again look for hands if there are any questions. And if you don't have a picture showing and you want to, I'm looking at some of the chat that I'm receiving. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you, Naomi, because this was asked and I neglected to mention it, that in the case of when you add a name, that is, whether it's Chaim or Chaya, connecting to life, that is something that's done. And this also, as I believe I think it was Mel who said it before, the idea of when you were, when somebody was really seriously ill, you would give them a new name. It didn't have to have Chaim in it, any name, to confuse the angel of death, the Malach HaMavis, so they would think they were at the wrong address. Oh no, this isn't, Moshe doesn't live here, this is Chaim, this is Shmuel. Shmulik's house, okay, fine, I'm looking for Moshe, goodbye, I'm at the wrong house. But the idea of adding Chaim, but there's another, by the way, Naomi, there's another addition which is very common. There are a lot of people whose first Hebrew name is Alter for a man or Alta for a woman, which means the old person, and that was a name given to a child. In other words, if you had a baby that was sick, or a very young child, a toddler or a kid that was ill, you would add a name and it would be the first name. This was If you see someone whose name is Alter Moshe David, his name was, when he was born, was Moshe David, and sadly he had a serious childhood illness, and they added the name Alter Old. In other words, to confuse the angel of death. Angel of death is like, you're going for a child, and no, this is Alter Kuk, this old person. It's not here, I'm at the wrong house. So that was the reason, again, to confuse the angel of death. So the name Alter was also very common as an addition to a name in order to confuse the angel of death and to give the person very ill. And there is a ritual to add a name. I've probably done it half a dozen times over 40 years. So it's not a common request that I have, but I've done it, and I can't say the success rate has been terrific, but it's still one of the things you do when you're really looking for a way to pray for somebody's well-being and you want to do everything you possibly can do. So there is a specific prayer ritual in order to add a name. It's not, it's not changing. The original name stands, but you're adding a name usually at the beginning. And that's why it's always it's an option, by the way. Let's say when you have a halachic issue, like let's say, for example, somebody is in the throes of major illness. It could be a person of any age, could be an elderly person. And you add a name again to try to confuse them, the Malach HaMavis, the angel of death. You add a name to the person's original Hebrew name, and then the person dies. In other words, it doesn't help. It doesn't help. Person passes away. Do you include the added name on the matzeva, on the memorial stone? My answer normally would be, if it's a name that the person was never known by, but you added it the last week before he died, I would not add it. I would not. I would not put it in the matzeva. But since there are no laws pertaining to what name can go in a matzeva, if someone really wants to, they can. You would add it, by the way, if it was a name that given in childhood, that now you're burying a person who's 95, and they were Alter, Alter Sarah Rivka or Alter Moshe Yaakov, and they went through life with that name, yeah, then you would include it because that became their name. It was when it was a name that they would call. One of the questions, by the way, that when I talked to Rabbi Scheim and he's asking me, he's doing a get for somebody, he calls me because I know that the family's connected to the shul, or I know them, or I did the wedding, and he wants to know, his first question is always, how was this person called to this Torah? What name was used to call him to the Torah? So I said, I have to say, I remember calling to the Torah. He never came to shul. Sometimes that's the, but if they, that's a way of knowing how you called to the, was that known as your Hebrew name? So if you're called to the Torah, Alter Moshe Yaakov, then Alter certainly should be part of your name after you're gone. If it was never known and it was just given at the, you wouldn't, at the last second, then it's, if the person wasn't known by that name, it's not considered to be required that it be included. But it's an interesting halachic question that comes up. I mean, it's not really halachic because names aren't really halachic, but it is halachic when it comes to writing a get because the name has to be exact. And the person was the person known, and it's usually the case of the parent's name. And I get this question a lot from Rabbi Scheim, my buddy, and he calls me a lot on these matters. And then he wants to, how is the person called to Torah? Sometimes I know because it's someone who came to shul, but usually it's someone either I never met or I did know them, but they came to shul 3 times a year and they didn't necessarily get aliyot in those 3 days. So it's hard for me to remember how they were known. But it becomes, it's a very interesting whole question of, we could do a whole hour on naming and beyond, and it's a fascinating topic in and of itself. So I'm going to see if there are other questions that you have now. I'm looking at text. Okay, John is asking the question in chat about shadim, devils, etc. We don't read that in the Torah, right? It's not a biblical concept really, and I'm not sure off the top of my head if there's any reference in later books of the Bible. In Nach, I don't know of any. I think a lot of these concepts are medieval, and there is borrowing that happens from non-Jewish society as well. We get to death in particular, we're going to see how that happens. There's a lot of borrowing of custom from non-Jewish society. And I'm sure as well, and we have, we know when we talk about birth today, we know about, in certain non-Jewish societies and cultures, there were amulets and other things you would put on the birthing bed in order to protect. So the same idea existed in other cultures and exists in other cultures as well. But it's not a biblical, shadim is not really a biblical concept. I want to see if there's, okay. I'll look for any hands now if there are any other questions. I have to go in 2 minutes. Okay, Mel, we'll get back to you. You asked a great question at the beginning, so I'm going to go back to you. Mel?
Yeah, Rabbi, you were speaking about the mirrors in a house of Shiva.
Right.
There is 2 concepts that I was taught.
Mm-hmm.
One was that the reason we walk the bereaved out of the house is that they take the neshama with them.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason to cover the mirrors was that the neshama was still in the house, and the mirror is covered for that reason.
Well, I think that probably exists as a reason. I think that has validity. I'm not sure it's the original reason, but I think it's certainly one of the interpretations that makes a lot of sense about why mirrors are covered. I do believe the original one was dealing with the shadim, but that's very possible. It makes a lot of sense. There are a lot of times where, again, when we talk about mourning practices where the submission is very, very, very heavy, very deeply involved. We look at a lot of the things that we do that, actually in weddings, I'm going to go to weddings, when the breaking of the glass, and we'll talk about that. I thought we'd get to that today. We'll get to that next week.
The other thing that I wanted to say, Rabbi, too, with that is when you speak of death or anything like that, I was always right away told, pull your left ear.
Well, I'm going to hold that thought until next week or the week after. We're going to talk about death. I don't want to get.
I might not be here.
Well, where are you going? You can't go anywhere now. You're going to be here. We need you. Stick around. No. We need you. So just a last comment, then I have to end because I have to go chair a meeting, an international meeting taking place. So I'm not going to be able to take any other questions today. I regret. But just a parting, the idea of was it you know, a lot of the things that we do, you know, again, the breaking of the glass under the chuppah we'll talk about next week, but that is something that you know, the origin undoubtedly has to do with shade and with evil spirits, but by the Middle Ages, people were embarrassed by that reason, because at a certain point in time, you know, superstition as narishkeit. So they came up with another theological reason, remembering Jerusalem, but that's late Middle Ages. That's not that's a relatively modernish kind of reason when people didn't want to say it was superstition. The same idea with mirrors, when you're saying, well, it's because vanity, you shouldn't care how you look. I mean, now today none of us can care how we look because of the lack of options available in the world for us right now. But there are, you know, but the original reason was not vanity for mirrors, and it was not, you know, or remembering Jerusalem for breaking the glass. There were other ways to remember Jerusalem. We will talk more about that next week. And it's a pleasure having so many of you today. I'm going to unmute you for a minute, all of you for a moment, and I have to go because I have to chair a global meeting. And so I have to be dealing with Israel and South America and Europe for the next half hour. So I wish all of you a healthy, good, safe day. And look forward to seeing all of you soon. Whether it's at Minyan, whether it's at the
Very
class.
same to you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so much.
Questions were
Everyone
amazing.
take care.
Bye. Be well,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Excellent
And
session.
also,
For next week.
Stay
feel
safe.
free, by the way, if you want to email me a question that we didn't get to today or that I may have missed in the chat, and I will raise it next week when we meet again. Okay, we'll continue. We'll
Okay.
do Superstition 2 will be next Tuesday.
All
Thank
right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
you. Bye-bye, all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you will.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Everybody take care.
Thank you.